Today, I would like to present a project that I did a year ago that focused on the pandemic, the biggest issue that we were facing last year. And in particular, it was focused on trying to stop the proliferation of fake news or trying to intervene in order to help local communities to improve their critical skills in order to be able to filter out what and decide for themselves what is worth believing and what not. This project was focused in the Brazilian context, which was a country that was hit the most, perhaps, by the fake news and the negative impact that they had on the efforts to try and mitigate the pandemic. So, during this presentation, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project context and the environment in which the project was conducted. Then I will share a few tips about what we found out based on our background investigation that laid foundation for the intervention that we've developed afterwards. Then I'll talk a little bit about some other efforts that have been created around the world, the games that were focused on COVID-19 and specifically the issue of fake news as well. And finally, the bulk of my talk will be about the actual game that we developed, which is a role-play game with Brazilian folk heroes. So first, a little bit about the project. So Brazil is quite a large country. It has a population of 240 million. And in this country, approximately a quarter of the population, 55 million, live below the poverty line established by the government. A lot of these people are clustered in metropolitan areas, and the distinctive characteristic of metropolitan areas in Brazil is geographic segregation into different socioeconomic groups. So such groups include favelas, and approximately 11 million, a bit more than 11 million people in Brazil live in favelas. Then there are clusters of homeless people, and approximately 100,000 people in Brazil are homeless, living in their own clusters. And then there is a large group that perhaps might have a less distinctive identity for the outside world, but still they are a distinctive group of low-skilled workers, for example, waste pickers, those who are doing waste recycling in Brazil. Metropolitan areas were disproportionately affected by the pandemic when the pandemic started. The death rates were significantly higher than in rural areas. For example, in the state of Goiás, where this project was conducted, approximately 46% of deaths were registered in its capital, Goiânia. And it's very likely that those numbers were underreported. The areas that are more deprived, for example, favelas, homeless communities, also were disproportionately more affected by the pandemic, partially because there were fewer efforts to try and contain the pandemic there, and partially because they don't have the same level of access to local services and specialized care. So, for example, the death rates in poor communities were approximately 20% of the total cases registered, as opposed to 5 to 8% in wealthier communities. There have been some interesting local initiatives to try and mitigate that in the early days. For example, in some favelas, criminal gangs imposed curfew in order to try and contain the spread of the pandemic. In other communities, local communities started their own newspapers in order to share news how to protect people themselves against the pandemic and to share the status of the pandemic in those areas. So all this provided us with rich environment in which we could conduct it. And of course, the final bit that was further worsening the situation in the country, which had among the highest rates of contamination in the world, was the proliferation of fake news that hindered any attempt to try and introduce any mitigating measures. And this is what we decided to focus on. And one aspect that we were considering really important is the aspect of critical thinking. So making informed decisions when you read the news, it requires having access to information, the ability to analyze information, and to categorize information in order to make such decision. And such skills are usually learned through socialization and education. If we're talking about fake news, we're talking about understanding what we're reading, prioritizing it, analyzing it, whether it's worth trusting it or not, and then categorizing it. Such skills are usually learned through socialization and education, as I said before, but of course, it is not a uniformly accepted criterion for having critical skills. And this is something we also observed in our background research, that although perhaps people with whom we interviewed might have had more or less a similar level of education and socialization, still they exhibited differences in critical skills and how they perceived the news. But what we thought was essential still was to try and focus on two main elements: the skills for processing beliefs and information and what people read in the news, and also making it into a habit, an everyday skill of trying to analyze. So it's not only enough to teach people skill, you also need to turn it into a habit of applying this skill. And here on the right, you can see Bloom's taxonomy, which was originally developed for students in order to try and classify different levels of critical thinking. But this can be applied to various different areas, not necessarily only to the skills that we acquire through education. Here you can see that we start with remembering facts, then we begin to understand those facts, we learn to apply them to new situation, then we learn to draw connections between different ideas and to analyze information, then we gain the skill of trying to evaluate and being able to evaluate different information in order to make the right decisions, and then finally we are able to create new or original work. In this project, we were perhaps trying to engage with the middle three levels, so understanding, applying, and analyzing, less so evaluating, although this aspect of critical thinking was also involved, and not so much creating and remembering. So what we did in the initial phase of this project is we went and interviewed people in the three types of communities that I've mentioned before: favelas, homeless, and low-skilled workers. We had local partners in Brazil. We worked with the Universidade Federal de Goiás in Brazil, and we also partnered up with different NGOs that helped us to gain access to those communities and to gain their trust, which is essential when you're talking about when you're trying to engage with disadvantaged groups. So these are the NGOs that we engaged with: CUFA, which is a central union of favelas in the whole of Brazil, and we've engaged with the regional representatives of Goiás. We've engaged with Unifort, which is a cooperative of waste pickers in Goiás. And we also engaged with Teo Cleobaldo Association, which provides free meals to homeless and engages with homeless and also provides them with some medical care and support. In the interviews, we've asked about the perceptions of the pandemic, how their life around them changed with the arrival of the pandemic. We've asked them about the sources of news, where they mostly learn about the pandemic, about the environment around them, and so on. And we've also asked them about the strategies of how they choose to believe different bits of news that they read. And all that helped us to understand which strategies they used for assessing the information critically, and where they mostly read the news, and how in general their life was affected. Here on the right, you can see photos from three different groups. So in the top right, you can see a photo of our local partners interviewing one of the waste collectors, waste pickers in the cooperative. In the middle, you can see the square where our partners are interviewing homeless. This is the square where they would usually gather and in order to get a meal from the association. And in the bottom, you see one of the participants from one of the favelas whom we interviewed. And this is your backyard of your home. Of course, it was not surprising that what we found was that impoverished communities were much more vulnerable to change. So, for example, if the work was their sole source of income and they didn't have any savings in order to get them through a dark day, if something happens, when the pandemic happened and many of them lost jobs, at least temporarily, it was a very desperate situation for them. They also had a sense of disempowerment. They saw a lot of hypocrisy around them, politicians talking, celebrities talking, and this made them feel disempowered. Many of them reported that at some point they started, they felt fear. And because of that, they reduced the news consumption. They started reading less because it was making them feel really bad. We, of course, looked at different demographic attributes, for example, age, gender, and we didn't really find any link between any of these attributes with how they perceived vaccine or they consumed news, what they chose to believe or not. We observed some really good examples of trying to sort out what to believe and what not. For example, cross-checking, relying on experts as opposed to celebrities, and some other good strategies. And of course, there were also examples of bad strategies. For example, trusting videos more than other news, simply because videos look more trustworthy, or relying on intuition. One of the respondents said, well, I can see it in their face. So that's how the respondent chose to believe whether this person is trustworthy or not. Another important parameter that we were testing was whether religion played any dominant role in how the news were perceived. But only very few participants actually all throughout the interviews were referring to their religious beliefs. Among others, we didn't really see about the majority that the religion played any role in how they perceived the news. So when we started thinking about what kind of gamified intervention we would want to introduce, of course, we started looking at what has already been done, and we came across several interesting examples, and I want to share a couple with you just to see what was done in this same area. The first one is the game, perhaps some of you might have come across with it, which is called Go Viral. It was developed at the University of Cambridge, and it was targeting individuals, trying to help them to learn how fake news are constructed and how they work, and how manipulative techniques are used when fake news are constructed, by making them the creators of fake news themselves. It's a very interesting approach. It's a short game. It doesn't require a lot of engagement from you. However, one limitation that we observed there is that there is a limited agency in this game. So if you don't want to create a fake news, you don't really have a choice. So the game kind of forces you into becoming one. So there are no different pathways. For example, if I really, really don't want to create fake news, is there an alternative way for me to learn about the techniques without having to create one? Therefore, it was an interesting learning point, but we thought that we were looking for a different approach. Another game was developed by as an academic group that was trying to make people critically assess what they read by creating several different roles and making people interact with each other and discuss and debate whether this news is trustworthy or not. And again, the techniques, the manipulative techniques used in fake news were also transmitted through for the game cards. But in this case, this game was a collaborative, and you were more like a police trying to detect those fake news. One limitation with this approach was that if it's implemented within the pandemic, you really have to be cautious of sharing objects between each other. So this was one of the strong limitations that we had. We had to design a solution that would not require people sharing objects. So collaborative games were a little bit more difficult in this respect. We looked at different options of what we could do, and then we decided to design a role-play game with Brazilian heroes. The basic structure of the game was that it's a collaborative game. In this game, every player assumes a folk hero from the Brazilian folklore tales. And the heroes have to work together, because only by working together they can overcome a challenge. The challenge is to fight a magic blight in the forest that affected the rainforest and that they've identified themselves. Each hero has a set of traits and abilities, and also has bits of information. Some information is essential to the challenge. Other information is completely irrelevant and can be disregarded, but they need to sort it out amongst themselves, which information is important and which not. They also might go down different strategies and different routes, and then different bits of information will become relevant or irrelevant. No one has complete information to find the solution, and therefore they really have to work together and choose which information to share and which not, and choose to trust each other or not. Throughout the game, they also encounter different characters. And through these encounters, they obtain new bits of information, and then they need to decide whether to trust these characters and this information or not. And finally, because it's an RPG game, and RPG games tend to be very unstructured and very, very creative, we tried to develop a structure in which different solutions would be possible depending on how the players choose to proceed and whether they choose to trust someone on the way or not. These are 5 main heroes that we used in the game, that were taken from folklore tales and that are very, very famous in Brazil. So everybody would know them, everybody could relate to them. These were the heroes that embarked on a story, and the setting of the game, the initial setting, provided a common motivation for the players to come together and prevent the blight. The main abilities of different heroes were, for example, Saki Pereira was a player who can choose to appear and disappear wherever he wished, and he could move long distances very fast. But this character cannot interact with animals if they encounter animals on the way, or if they need to engage animals in their activities. Then there are 2 water-based heroes, Yara and Boto. And they can be either engage both of them, and they would have more or less the same skills, or the players could choose to play one of them depending on how many players you will have. They are free explorers, and they travel across ponds and rivers, but they cannot climb, for example, climb trees, and they cannot run fast on land. They are slow movers. So if there is a requirement to climb the tree to gather an ingredient, for example, they wouldn't be able to do it. Then there is a character called Kaipora. This character can manipulate the soil, can dig holes and make plants grow, is very good with plants, but cannot interact with fire. So if there is a need to use fire for that purpose, this character would not be able to do it. And finally, there is Kurupira, the character who can use their fire and is very good in using fire for burning, for cooking, for doing all sorts of things with fire. But because of that, this character cannot interact with water. So if there is something in the water that they need, this character would not be able to do that. Because we realized that the RPG setting would probably not be intuitively clear for the participants. Most of them probably would never have played such games before. And having a very highly creative approach where they are free to do whatever they want might lead to the paralysis of the player because they wouldn't know what to do. We decided to structure this game by giving them a set of cards. Each character had cards which described their skills, for example, knowledge cards, what they knew, or their strengths and weaknesses, and also some other cards that they were sent. For example, in this example here, we have cards for Kurupira. And here the cards describe that Kurupira is good with fire and can do all sorts of things with fire, but the character is afraid of water and wouldn't be able to handle anything. The character has knowledge of some tools which the group might encounter on the way and would know what to do with them. The character also has some knowledge of local communities, so would be able to use their knowledge if necessary. And the character also has a knowledge of a blue flower, which is a special ingredient, one of the ingredients that the players had together. And what was special about it was that 3 of the 4 players had a knowledge card of a blue flower, but each of those blue flowers was a different one. The 4th character had a random card that they chose with a blue flower, which was the ingredient required for the medicine. But they didn't immediately show the cards to everyone. Of course, they could, but they didn't necessarily do it. So they would have to discuss among themselves and identify which of these blue flowers is the right one. So, critical thinking components in the game. So first of all, there was the main theme of collecting, sharing, and analyzing information in order to overcome the challenge. The players had to collect some information on the way. They had to actively ask questions from the facilitator in order to get that information, and perhaps sometimes the facilitator would prompt them to collect this information. They had to share information with each other in order for everybody to understand what they know and therefore to have this knowledge. And they also had to analyze information, which information was relevant and which not, in order to overcome this challenge. They had a common goal which motivated them to engage in a teamwork and to develop trust. Each participant had an ability that made them important to the team and made their contribution important. So here we have an element of collecting information. The success relied on sharing this information. The plan should be collaborated between the participants. They had to all agree on what they would do in order to achieve the goal and in order to proceed through each step of the journey. And then there was an element of guided reflection with facilitator. When they would encounter something, the facilitator might prompt an analysis and reflection on what they have encountered and how their decisions impacted the progress of the situation. And Now I would like to talk through the narrative itself, how the game looked. First of all, at the beginning, each character sensed that there was something unnatural, and they all gathered at the bank of a river in the rainforest, and they all wanted to investigate or help in order to resolve this uneasiness. They've encountered certain objects on the way, and they decided whether they want to take them or not. And one of the characters had the knowledge of those objects and shared whether those objects were useful or not. And then they had to find a way to cross the river. For example, they could perhaps cut a tree and cross the river through the fallen tree, or they could walk a little bit upstream to find the bridge. So there could be different solutions possible. That was the first small mini challenge. Upon crossing the river, they discovered a blight affecting trees and plants, and there they were offered to investigate. So, for example, they could smell it, and then the facilitator would give a feedback that the blight had a sweet smelling. They could touch it perhaps, and then they would see that it's quite wet and sticky. They could apply fire to it, and they would see that fire doesn't do anything to the blight. It's not affected. Perhaps they might want to try and taste it, and then the facilitator would describe the taste of the blight, and so on and so forth. So there could be different ways of investigating it. Once they finished, they encountered the first character, a white deer, Ananga, that appeared before them and shared information about the medicine that could stop the blight. And this medicine required different ingredients. Each ingredient had certain characteristics, and different characters had knowledge of those ingredients, and they had also the location of these ingredients, and they also had to engage with their abilities in order to obtain these ingredients. The white deer would also prompt Saki, the character with the medical knowledge, to draw on their knowledge more and help all the other characters to gather required ingredients in order to make the medicine. Then the characters engage on a journey to try and collect the ingredients. So the first one is a blue flower, and I've already described the challenge with a blue flower, that there are several types, and you need to choose which is the right one and then to find it. Then there is an ingredient which is water wheat, and the characters that are accustomed to water would know where you can find water wheat, but they would be familiar with several varieties. And the character Saki, who has the medical knowledge, would know which is the correct one and which variety of wheat they would require to acquire. Then there was the ingredient called mushroom, and one of the characters had the knowledge of this ingredient and where to find it. And when they went to find it, they had to go inside the cave, and after they've procured the mushroom, they started hearing voices, and then they had to choose whether they want to continue the investigation and go inside the cave and see whose voices they are or not. If they choose to go and investigate, then they would encounter another character who looked a little bit suspicious and didn't share too much information with them, but it was cooking something, saying that it was a medicine from a blight. But this character was missing one ingredient, and the character asked the group to go and procure this ingredient. So the group had to decide whether they want to trust this character or not. Regardless of what they choose, they either procure this ingredient and get the medicine from this character or not. If not, then they just finish collecting the ingredients they need, Then they cook the medicine. For that, they need boiling water. And finally, they apply this medicine to the blight. Either the medicine that Cook prepared for them or the medicine that they've prepared themselves. So again, there are different routes how the group can achieve their objective. Finally, once they've applied the medicine, the blight disappears. And then there is an additional element of reflection. So if some characters chose to apply the blight with their bare hands, or if some characters, while investigating the blight, tried or ate them, the blight disappeared, but they became affected with the blight. And then they would have to choose whether they want to apply the medicine to themselves or not. And at this point, this helps to draw the parallel between not only the pandemic and the blight, but also the medicine and the vaccine, to see whether this imaginary experience that they've had would be translated and recontextualized in real life. For example, whether they would decide to use a vaccine or not. Before I talk to you a little bit about some of the initial results that we got from the initial trials of this game, I want to present to you an alternative approach that we also considered quite seriously, but unfortunately ran out of time, so we decided to focus on the first approach. The second approach was that we seriously considered was a branching out visual story. In this story, there would be a hero journey where a hero would have a dream, and then the pandemic would put this dream at risk. And then the hero would be guided through the situation and is offered a solution, or will find a solution. And there we wanted to structure the story in 3 different parts. In the first part, the setting where we are introduced to the hero and to their dream. We expose the player to information filtering strategies through secondary characters. So, for example, different bits of information that the character read and chose to believe or not. And then the feedback through secondary characters about whether it was a good decision to trust this information or not. And if not, what would be a good strategy to filter out wrong information. Then in the second part, the player would be offered to apply these skills to everyday situations that would require making decisions based on available information, perhaps an abundance of information, perhaps wrong information. And again, there would be a feedback provided through secondary characters to help people improve their skills of filtering information. This aspect is important because here the character would be applying their skills to a situation which is not loaded with context of the pandemic and all the emotions that are involved in that. And finally, once they've tried to apply those skills, they would be offered to apply those skills in pandemic-related situations. For example, to make a decision whether to vaccinate yourself and your family or not. And again, the feedback would be provided through secondary characters, and then there would be a resolution which might be both successful and unsuccessful, depending on the choices that the main character made. What is principally different about this approach is that, on the one hand, it doesn't have this collaborative approach where different players would come together and start interacting with each other and trying to develop trust to each other, to filter information that each other are knowing. On the other hand, this approach through iterative cycles will help to develop not only the skill, but also the habit of applying this skill to different situations. And this is what is the crucial bit in critical thinking. You develop not only the skill or understanding of how to filter information, but you also develop a habit of doing it through repeated application of skills. The other benefit of this approach was that If it's a mobile-based game, and this could be made in both versions, a paper-based and a mobile-based game, this could be a highly scalable approach to disseminate it across various different communities. However, we didn't go with this approach. Instead, we went with RPG, which was also a very, very interesting way to engage with participants. And overall, the feedback was that participants enjoyed the game. Taking up the role of heroes had an element of empowerment. They felt that they were in control of something, they could have an impact on something. They came up with lots of creative ideas and solutions, and more than we could possibly have imagined. And this discussion was also a playground for them to facilitate more serious discussions about the matters like politics, environment, COVID-19 during the gameplay, but it also provided a safe environment while they were in those roles. They were less emotional about their own biases and beliefs and more willing to listen to each other and the opinions of each other. This is the sub-team of the project, those who were involved in the design of the game. So myself, the PI for that part of the project, Gana Berzenkova, who was doing most of the artworks, and Amber McManamy, who was designing most of the game structure. And finally, this project was conducted in collaboration with the Universidad Federal de Goiás and was funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK as part of Global Challenges Research Fund. That was all that I wanted to present to you today. Now I believe we have 7 minutes for questions.
Yes, we do. We'll there's a slight delay from the streaming, so we'll give it a moment for the questions. But first of all, thank you very much, Agnes. It was really good and a much deeper insight into it than we had on the podcast interview. I think, or maybe I just like the visuals.
I think the podcast was about another project. I briefly mentioned this one, but
at the beginning, yeah. So let's have a look at some of the comments. First of all, Anureza, he liked your game that you mentioned, Go Viral.
Yeah, it's a nice game. Yeah.
Are there any other games you take inspiration from, do you think?
We looked at some other games which were more focused on the pandemic itself, not so much on fake news, but more on how to protect yourself. So there have been several games, quite basic games, developed by the UN and by World Health Organizations. We've also we were inspired, especially in the alternative approach, by a game developed for NHS for exploring ethical issues. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of that game now, but if anyone is interested, I can find the link and share it with others. So it was developed by a game designer in Liverpool, and the structure was similar. So you have a branching out narrative, and then you're presented with ethical choices, for example, to prioritize this or that patient, and then perhaps to share information about this patient with, I don't know, relatives or not. And then there is no right or wrong answer. And depending on the choice you make, you deal with the consequences. So I believe it's a very interesting approach to try and build the capacity for decision making in these kind of challenging situations.
I think you're right. Also, I mean, not quite the same, but our panel session this afternoon is about the ethics of gamification in health. So it could be, yeah, it'd be great if you could share a link to that.
Yeah,
if you stick it in the chat in a minute, that would be fantastic. What do we got here from Jennifer? That's a pretty simple question, probably. Many references from Brazil. Where are you from?
I'm not from Brazil.
I think the question there in that case is like, how did you find someone to work with who was interested in the Brazil side of things? I'm always interested in how the collaboration happens.
Initially, the first collaboration happened between a colleague of mine and the Brazilian partners when they approached him, and he was from Strathclyde, and they were looking for someone in the UK working in the area of supply chain. So they've created a project, applied for funding, got the funding. They involved me because I was. They wanted me to help out with some workshops to try and explore the issue, and this is how I developed a relationship with one of the partners in Brazil. And then we were looking for other topics to work together. And when the pandemic happened, we started discussing what could we do, and we started exploring different issues of what potentially could be done and what's in our power to do. And this is how we developed this collaboration. That's a little
Where
bit
do you
random.
think? Yeah, no, that's fine. Where do you think you could go with this? In terms of like dealing with fake news, critical thinking, can you take it online? Have you thought about how to reach different audiences?
Ideally, I think if we were to go for the alternative approach that I've described, the branching out story, I think it could easily be recontextualized for other applications. First of all, if it's a mobile game, it's by default online, so anybody could potentially download it. We could incorporate different languages, and we could develop different episodes for different cultural contexts. In research, the issue is always funding. And now that the pandemic becomes less of a priority, we have to think about other challenges.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Ali Reza also says, yes, a great candidate for a mobile game, this idea in the chat. What are you working on next in the realm of gamification and research?
Currently, I'm working on several projects in the space of net zero. I'm very passionate about the topic of sustainability, and I'm looking currently at, in one project, influencing drivers' behavior to make them accelerate less and not do harsh braking, not do idling when they stop. In order to reduce fuel consumption and therefore CO2 emissions. And the other project I'm developing just now is about sustainable transportation choices in national parks. Because especially in the UK, national parks are also urban areas where people live, and the transportation infrastructure has not been designed for such an increase in visitors. So we have to rethink how we navigate around national parks, and we have to and my idea is that we would use gamification to try and encourage people towards more sustainable transportation choices to both help the environment, help the local flora and fauna and its diversity, but also help reduce the strain on the local infrastructure.
I think that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, I mean, I live on the edge of one of those national parks, and it got very busy over the past 2 years. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Relate to that.
Well, thank you so much, Agnesa. I think that was a really great talk, really insightful, and I hope you can stick around and answer any people's questions in the chat. But thank you so much.
Thank you.